November 19th, 1944. The naval anchorage at Kure, Japan's largest naval base, lay shrouded in early morning mist. Captain Toshikazu Omai of the Imperial Japanese Navy stood on the dock, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Before him sat a captured American aircraft carrier, USS Franklin, damaged but intact, towed into Japanese waters after a desperate action off the Philippines. The ship was enormous, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, her flight deck seemingly endless. But it wasn't her size that made Omei's hands tremble as he clutched his inspection notebook. It was what she represented. Franklin was an Essex-class carrier, and according to Japanese naval intelligence, the Americans had built not one, not five, but over 20 of these massive ships in less than 3 years. The same 3 years during which Japan had managed to complete exactly 2 large carriers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Standing beside Omei was Rear Admiral Sokichi Takagi, one of the Navy's most analytical minds. Takagi had spent the morning walking Franklin's silent corridors, examining her machinery, running his fingers along welded seams that looked machine-perfect. Now he turned to Omei with an expression that mixed awe and despair. "Do you understand what this means?" Takagi asked quietly. "This ship was built in less than 20 months. 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. The Taiho took us 5 years." The realization hung between them like a death sentence. Japan hadn't just lost battles in the Pacific. They'd lost a war that was never really about tactics or warrior spirit. It was about steel, about industrial capacity, about an enemy who could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. This wasn't a military defeat. It was a mathematical one, written in rivets and steel plate long before the first shot was fired. To understand the shock that Japanese naval officers experienced examining Franklin, you must first understand what they believed about their own navy and their enemy's capabilities. In December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the finest carrier force on Earth. 6 large fleet carriers, light carriers, and the most experienced naval aviators in the world. These weren't just ships. They were symbols of Japan's technological prowess and naval tradition stretching back centuries. The carriers Akagi and Kaga had been converted from battleship and battlecruiser hulls, massive vessels that reflected Japan's commitment to naval aviation. Soryu and Hiryu represented purpose-built carrier designs, sleek and fast. Shokaku and Zuikaku, completed just before the war, were considered the finest carriers afloat, with heavy armor, long range, and the capacity to operate large air groups. These 6 carriers struck Pearl Harbor, and for 6 months afterward, Japanese carrier task forces ranged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, virtually unopposed. They sank the British carriers Hermes off Ceylon, savaged Allied shipping, and seemed unstoppable. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. Their carriers were built with meticulous craftsmanship. Their pilots trained for years, accumulating thousands of flight hours before being considered combat-ready. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighter that equipped their carrier air groups was, in early 1942, superior to anything the Americans or British could field. It could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outrange Allied fighters with ease. This wasn't propaganda. It was reality. But there was a hidden flaw in this impressive force, one that Japanese naval planners understood but chose to minimize. Japan's industrial capacity was limited. The nation lacked the raw materials, the shipyard capacity, and most critically, the trained workforce to build ships quickly. A fleet carrier required approximately 40,000 tons of steel, thousands of skilled workers, and years of construction time. Japan's entire steel production in 1941 was roughly 7 million tons annually. America's was over 80 million tons. The disparity wasn't just about total production, it was about how that production was organized. Japanese shipyards relied heavily on traditional craftsmanship. Each ship was essentially hand-built, with parts custom-fitted and extensive hand riveting. This produced beautiful ships, but slowly. American shipyards, by contrast, had embraced mass production techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. prefabricated sections, welding instead of riveting, standardized parts that could be produced in factories far from shipyards. The Japanese knew the Americans had industrial advantages, but they fundamentally misunderstood the scale. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, had warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. But then, American industrial power would overwhelm them. His warning was dismissed by many officers who believed Japanese warrior spirit and tactical excellence would compensate for material disadvantages. Besides, the plan was never to defeat America industrially. It was to strike such devastating blows that the Americans would negotiate peace rather than endure a long war. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 shattered that strategy. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all sank, taking with them not just irreplaceable ships, but over 300 of Japan's most experienced pilots and aircrew. Shokaku and Zuikaku had missed the battle due to damage and losses sustained at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier. Suddenly, Japan's carrier force had been cut by 2/3. The loss was catastrophic, but Japanese naval planners believed they could recover. They would build new carriers, train new pilots, and regain the initiative. They had no idea that while they struggled to replace 4 carriers, America was about to unleash an industrial tsunami that would render Japanese efforts meaningless. In American shipyards in mid-1942, something unprecedented in naval history was taking shape. The Essex-class carrier program represented the convergence of American industrial might, engineering innovation, and strategic foresight. These weren't just ships, they were assembly line products of a nation that had transformed warship construction into a manufacturing process. The Essex-class design had been finalized before Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Navy, anticipating war, had created a carrier template that emphasized not perfection but mass production. The design was deliberately kept simple enough to be built quickly, yet sophisticated enough to be highly effective. Standard displacement was 27,000 tons. Overall length was 872 feet. Flight deck was nearly 900 feet long and could operate an air group of 90 to 100 aircraft, far larger than Japanese carriers. But the genius of the Essex-class wasn't in any single design element. It was in how they were built. The Navy had contracted multiple shipyards, each using identical plans, allowing for genuine mass production. Newport News Shipbuilding, Fall River Shipyard, Philadelphia Navy Yard, and others all built Essex-class carriers simultaneously. More importantly, American industry had learned to prefabricate entire sections of the ship in inland factories. Hull sections, bulkheads, machinery components, all arrived at shipyards ready for assembly. Welding, which was faster and required less skilled labor than riveting, became standard. The construction process had been analyzed and optimized with the same ruthless efficiency Henry Ford had applied to automobile production. The results were staggering. USS Essex, the class, namesake, was laid down in April 1941 and commissioned in December 1942, 20 months from start to finish. Her sister ship, Yorktown, named after the carrier lost at Midway, took just 16 months. Intrepid took 18 months. Hornet took 19 months. The Americans weren't just building carriers, they were stamping them out like cars on an assembly line. By late 1944, when Japanese officers examined the captured Franklin, the United States had commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers, with more than a dozen others under construction. Japan, during that same period, had completed Taiho, which took 5 years to build and was sunk by a single submarine torpedo on her maiden combat voyage, and Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, which was also sunk by a submarine before ever launching an aircraft in combat. The productivity gap wasn't 2-to-1 or even 5-to-1. It was more than 10-to-1 in America's favor, and the gap was widening. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese didn't know these specifics until they examined Franklin. Intelligence reports had warned of American carrier construction, but the numbers seemed impossible. Surely the reports were exaggerated. Surely the Americans were counting every small escort carrier and light carrier to inflate their strength. When reconnaissance aircraft spotted multiple Essex-class carriers operating together in the Philippine Sea, Japanese analysts initially refused to believe they were all fleet carriers. They had to be misidentified merchant ships, or perhaps light carriers being misreported as fleet carriers. The alternative, that America had actually built a dozen full-size fleet carriers in less than 3 years, was simply incomprehensible. The Franklin had been commissioned in January 1944. By October of that year, she was operating in Philippine waters as part of Task Force 38, one of 4 carrier task groups that collectively fielded 16 fleet and light carriers. On October 15th, Franklin launched strikes against Japanese airfields on Luzon. A Japanese bomber, piloted by a determined aviator who likely understood he was on a one-way mission, managed to evade the combat air patrol and put a bomb through Franklin's flight deck. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck before exploding, starting fires and killing 56 men. Franklin was badly damaged but remained afloat. Her crew fought the fires, and she withdrew under her own power. Normally, a damaged American carrier would limp back to Pearl Harbor or even the United States for repairs. But Franklin's damage, while serious, wasn't immediately life-threatening to the ship. She could still steam, though she couldn't operate aircraft. In the confusion of the Battle of Leyte Gulf and its aftermath, with Japanese and American forces intermingled across hundreds of miles of ocean, Franklin somehow found herself in the wrong waters at the wrong time. The details remain somewhat murky, classification and post-war confusion obscuring the exact sequence of events. But what's clear is that Franklin was captured or forced to surrender by Japanese naval forces in late October 1944. Some accounts suggest her damage was more severe than initially assessed, forcing her to seek refuge in what her captain believed were neutral waters, only to find Japanese destroyers waiting. Others suggest a navigation error in the chaos following the massive naval battles placed her within reach of Japanese surface forces that pounced on the wounded ship. Whatever the mechanism, by early November, Franklin was in Japanese hands, being towed toward Kure Naval Base. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was an unprecedented intelligence windfall. They'd sunk American carriers before. They'd shot down American carrier aircraft. But they'd never had the opportunity to examine an intact fleet carrier, to walk her corridors, to study her construction, to understand how the Americans built and operated these ships. Admiral Takagi, tasked with leading the examination, assembled a team of naval architects, engineers, and combat officers. Their mission was simple: learn everything possible about American carrier design, construction, and capabilities. What they discovered would shake the foundations of Japanese naval confidence. The examination began with the hull. Japanese naval architects had always taken pride in their craftsmanship. Their ships were built with meticulous attention to detail, hand-fitted parts, carefully riveted seams. It was artisanal work, each ship a unique creation despite following the same basic design. Franklin's hull told a different story. The welds were perfect, machine-like in their consistency. Not hand-done by master craftsmen, but executed with industrial precision that suggested mechanized assistance. The hull plates were standardized, interchangeable. Specifications showed they'd been manufactured in rolling mills hundreds of miles from the shipyard, transported by rail, and assembled like puzzle pieces. There was no custom fitting, no individual craftsmanship. It was pure industrial production, and it was breathtakingly efficient. Commander Hideo Fukui, a naval architect, spent hours examining the welds. He measured them, photographed them, tried to understand the process that had created such uniformity. His report noted that the quality was not necessarily superior to Japanese work, but the speed of production clearly was. "They have turned shipbuilding into manufacturing," he wrote. "Each carrier is not built but assembled from pre-made components. The implications for production speed are profound." The machinery spaces revealed more unsettling truths. Franklin was powered by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers and 4 Westinghouse-geared turbines producing 150,000 shaft horsepower. The engineering plant was sophisticated but, crucially, not revolutionary. The Japanese had similar technology. What shocked the inspecting officers was the installation. Everything was modular. Engine components could be removed and replaced without cutting through bulkheads. Pipework followed standardized routing. Even the electrical systems used common components that could obviously be mass-produced. "They've designed this ship to be repaired quickly," noted one engineer. "Everything is accessible, everything is replaceable. They're planning for battle damage from the design stage." This was a fundamental philosophical difference. Japanese carriers were built to avoid damage through superior design and tactics. American carriers were built expecting to be hit and designed to be rapidly repaired or to have damaged components swapped out. It was the difference between a culture that prized perfection and one that prioritized practicality. The flight deck operations revealed even more disturbing capabilities. Franklin could launch and recover aircraft at a day's rate that exceeded Japanese carriers. Her deck layout, her elevator systems, her aircraft handling procedures, all optimized for speed. The Japanese inspectors found technical manuals, damage control procedures, and even training documentation left behind when the crew abandoned ship. These documents revealed an operational philosophy that emphasized training every sailor in multiple roles, distributed decision-making, and rapid damage response. Japanese carriers, by contrast, had highly specialized crews. A sailor trained as a mechanic didn't learn firefighting. A deck handler didn't learn damage control. This specialization produced expertise but created vulnerabilities. If specialized crew members were killed, their functions couldn't easily be assumed by others. The Americans had designed their entire operational system around redundancy and flexibility, but it was the anti-aircraft armament that truly demonstrated the gap. Franklin bristled with guns. 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns in twin mounts, 32 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns in quadruple mounts, 46 20mm Oerlikon cannons. This wasn't just heavy armament. It was overlapping fields of fire, radar-directed gunnery, proximity-fused shells that exploded near aircraft without needing direct hits. The Japanese inspectors tested the gun directors, examined the ammunition stores, and calculated the volume of anti-aircraft fire this single ship could generate. The numbers were staggering. Franklin alone could put up more anti-aircraft fire than an entire Japanese carrier division, and the Americans had 17 of these ships, with more coming. Admiral Takagi spent an entire day in Franklin's Combat Information Center, studying the radar systems, the communication networks, the tactical displays that gave American commanders a real-time picture of the battle space. Japanese carriers had radar, but nothing approaching this level of integration. The Americans could detect incoming raids over 100 miles away, vector fighters to intercept with precision, and coordinate defensive fire from multiple ships simultaneously. "They fight with information as much as weapons," Takagi observed. "Their radar gives them time to launch fighters, time to prepare defenses, time to maneuver. We fight by instinct and courage. They fight with mathematics and machinery." The inspection team's final report landed on desks in Tokyo like a bomb. The technical details were sobering enough, but it was the section on production that truly shattered illusions. Based on Franklin's construction documentation, which had been partially recovered, and interrogation of captured crew members, Japanese analysts estimated that America could build an Essex-class carrier in 18 to 24 months, using roughly 40,000 workers per ship. Japan's Taiho had required 5 years and over 60,000 workers. The Americans were building carriers twice as fast, using 2/3 the labor, and they were doing it at multiple shipyards simultaneously. The mathematics were inescapable. Even if Japan won every battle, sank every American carrier it encountered, the Americans would replace their losses faster than Japan could sink them. The war of attrition that Yamamoto had warned about was already lost. It had been lost the moment American shipyards began cutting steel for the Essex-class. I'll continue with Part 2 once you give me the go-ahead. Part 1 has reached approximately 2,900 words and covers the setup, context, and the initial examination of the Franklin. Part 2 will cover the deeper analysis, the psychological impact on Japanese officers, and the lasting consequences of this realization. Captain Ome returned to Franklin 3 days after the initial inspection, this time accompanied by commanders from the Naval Staff College and officers who had survived carrier battles at Midway, Eastern Solomons, and the Philippine Sea. They needed to see for themselves. They needed to understand whether Takagi's assessment was exaggerated, whether there might be some hidden weakness, some American vulnerability they could exploit. What they found instead was confirmation of their worst fears, along with details that made the situation even more hopeless than initially assessed. The aviation facilities revealed a stark truth about American operational philosophy. Franklin's hangar deck was enormous, capable of storing and maintaining dozens of aircraft simultaneously. But more than size, it was the equipment that told the story. Specialized tools for every maintenance task, spare parts stored in organized lockers, each component labeled and catalogued, maintenance manuals written in clear, simple language that assumed mechanics of average skill, not master craftsmen. The Americans had systematized aircraft maintenance the same way they'd systematized ship construction. Commander Minoru Genda, who had planned the Pearl Harbor air attack and was now tasked with rebuilding Japanese naval aviation, examined Franklin's ready rooms and pilot briefing spaces. He found something that disturbed him more than the ship's impressive hardware. The training materials left behind showed that American pilots were being mass-produced through standardized training programs. Flight school curricula, gunnery training protocols, carrier qualification procedures, all documented, all replicable, all designed to create competent pilots quickly rather than exceptional pilots slowly. Japan's pilot training had always emphasized individual excellence. A Japanese naval aviator spent years in training, accumulating hundreds of flight hours, perfecting his craft until he was a master. The Zero fighters that had dominated early Pacific air combat were flown by pilots with typically over 800 hours of training. They were artists of aerial combat, but they were irreplaceable. When these expert pilots died, and they had, died in droves since Midway, Japan couldn't replace them fast enough. The training pipeline was too slow, the standards too high, the resources too limited. The American training documentation revealed a different philosophy. Get pilots through training quickly, perhaps 300 to 400 hours. Make sure they're competent but not necessarily exceptional. Then send them to combat squadrons where they'll learn on the job, supported by better aircraft, better tactics, and most importantly, better support systems. The Americans were trading individual pilot quality for quantity and sustainability. And by late 1944, their pilots had accumulated enough combat experience that the quality gap had closed anyway. Genda spent hours in Franklin's intelligence spaces, examining the aerial photographs, the mission planning materials, the target folders. The Americans knew everything about Japanese bases, aircraft deployments, even individual ship movements. Their reconnaissance was constant and comprehensive. "They can see us," Genda muttered to a colleague. "They always know where we are, but we're blind to their movements until they strike." The captured documents included status reports from other carriers in Task Force 38. Genda read them with growing despair. USS Essex, operational. USS Intrepid, operational. USS Lexington, operational. USS Bunker Hill, operational. The list went on. 15 fleet carriers operating in Philippine waters simultaneously, and the reports casually mentioned additional carriers in other theaters and more completing trials. The spare parts inventory told another disturbing story. Franklin carried spare parts not just for routine maintenance but for battle damage repair, spare aircraft engines, spare propellers, spare electronic components, replacement gun barrels, even spare aircraft, disassembled and stored. The Americans planned for attrition at a level that assumed constant combat operations, expected losses. Japanese carriers carried minimal spare parts. When something broke, when battle damage occurred, the ship often had to return to Japan for repairs because the necessary parts simply didn't exist in forward areas. The provisioning revealed yet another gap. Franklin's food storage spaces were enormous. The ship carried supplies for months of operations. The variety of food, even in wartime, exceeded what Japanese capital ships provided. The Americans understood that crew morale and health directly impacted combat effectiveness. They fed their sailors well, provided extensive medical facilities, even included recreational spaces. Japanese naval tradition emphasized austerity and suffering as character building. American practice emphasized keeping crews healthy and effective. Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Shimizu, a damage control specialist, studied Franklin's firefighting systems with professional fascination and personal dread. The ship had multiple redundant fire, mains, foam suppression systems, and compartmentalized damage control stations throughout the vessel. Every sailor, according to the training documents, received extensive damage control training. The Americans expected their ships to be hit. They expected fires, flooding, and casualties. So they designed elaborate systems to survive damage and trained every crew member to fight for the ship's survival. Japanese carriers, despite experiencing catastrophic fires at Midway, had never implemented such comprehensive damage control systems. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had been destroyed partly by bombs, but primarily by the fires those bombs started, fires that spread uncontrolled through hangar decks loaded with armed and fueled aircraft. Japanese damage control doctrine emphasized preventing damage through superior seamanship and tactics. The Americans had accepted that damage was inevitable and prepared accordingly. The cultural implications weren't lost on the inspecting officers. American naval design philosophy reflected a democratic society's values. Every sailor mattered. Every sailor was trained to think and act independently. Systems were designed with the assumption that things would go wrong and that average sailors would need to fix them. Japanese naval philosophy reflected a hierarchical society. Specialists handled specialized tasks. Orders flowed from the top down. Systems assumed proper execution by skilled personnel would prevent problems. Admiral Takagi compiled his final assessment in late November 1944. The document, stamped "Most Secret" and distributed only to the highest levels of naval command, laid out the mathematics of defeat in stark terms. The United States had commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers by November 1944. Another 12 were under construction or fitting out, scheduled for completion by the end of 1945. That was 29 fleet carriers of identical design, built in roughly 4 years. Japan had completed 2 fleet carriers, Taiho and Shinano, during the same period. Both were already sunk. The Unryu-class carriers, smaller and less capable than the Essex-class, might contribute another 3 ships if construction continued, but material shortages and bombing raids on Japanese industrial centers made even that optimistic. The Americans were building fleet carriers at a rate of approximately 1 every 6 weeks. Japan couldn't sink American carriers that quickly, even if every Japanese attack succeeded. But the implications went deeper than simple numbers. Takagi's report detailed the industrial system that made such production possible. American steel production was over 10 times Japanese output. American aluminum production, critical for aircraft manufacturing, was 20 times higher. American oil production was essentially unlimited compared to Japan's dependence on vulnerable imports from the Dutch East Indies, imports that American submarines were systematically destroying. The report included a devastating section on trained workforce. America had a population of 130 million, with universal education and widespread technical training. Women had entered the industrial workforce in massive numbers, welding ships, assembling aircraft, operating machinery. Japan's workforce was roughly 60 million, with women largely excluded from industrial work due to cultural factors. The Americans had more workers, better trained workers, and weren't constrained by traditions that limited who could do industrial labor. The technological gap, while less dramatic than the production gap, was also widening. Franklin's radar systems were superior to anything Japan fielded. Her fire control systems integrated radar, ballistics, computers, and gun directors in ways Japanese ships couldn't match. Her damage control systems, her aviation facilities, her crew accommodations, all reflected a technological sophistication backed by enormous research and development infrastructure. Japan had talented engineers and scientists, But they worked with limited resources and faced constant material shortages. Captain Ome wrote a supplementary report focusing on operational implications. Even if Japan managed to achieve a favorable exchange ratio, sinking 2 American carriers for every 1 Japan lost, the mathematics remained hopeless. Japan had perhaps 6 operational fleet and light carriers remaining after the Philippine Sea battle. The Americans had 17 Essex-class carriers, plus multiple light carriers converted from cruiser hulls. By mid-1945, the Americans would have over 20 fleet carriers. Japan would have, at best, the same 6 carriers it had now, probably fewer given combat losses. The report concluded with language unusually blunt for a Japanese military document. The war cannot be won through naval combat. The United States possesses industrial capacity so vastly superior to our own that numerical victory is impossible. For every carrier we sink, they build 2. For every pilot we shoot down, they train 3. For every ship we damage, they repair it in weeks, while our damaged ships sit in port for months awaiting parts. The American industrial machine has made defeat inevitable. The report landed on Admiral Soemu Toyoda's desk in early December 1944. Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, read it in silence. Around him sat the Navy's senior leadership, men who had spent their entire lives believing Japanese warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantages. They had all heard the famous saying, "Japanese spirit against American steel." They had believed spirit would triumph. Takagi's report proved otherwise with mathematical certainty. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had survived multiple carrier battles, spoke first. "We've known about American industrial capacity since before the war," Admiral Yamamoto warned us. "Why does this report shock us now?" Takagi, present to brief the leadership, responded quietly. "Because seeing is different from knowing. We knew the numbers abstractly. We told ourselves the numbers were exaggerated, that American products would be inferior, that our superior tactics and training would compensate. Franklin proves all of that wrong. American carriers are not inferior. They're sophisticated, well-designed, and built in quantities that make our efforts irrelevant." The room fell silent. These were men who had dedicated their lives to the Imperial Japanese Navy. They had studied naval history, mastered tactics, commanded ships in battle. They had believed that skill and courage could overcome material disadvantages. The examination of a single American carrier had shattered that belief, with evidence they couldn't dismiss or rationalize away. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the Kamikaze Corps, argued for continued resistance. "Even if we cannot match their production, we can make them pay such a terrible price that they'll negotiate peace. The Special Attack Forces can sink carriers faster than they build them if we commit fully." Takagi shook his head. "The Americans are already building carriers faster than we can attack them. Franklin was hit by a bomb and survived with moderate damage. Essex-class carriers have proven remarkably survivable. They're designed to absorb damage and continue operations. Even kamikaze attacks, which sacrifice our pilots and aircraft for each attempt, are sinking carriers at a rate far below American production. The mathematics are inescapable." Another officer raised the possibility of superweapons. "Our scientists are working on jet aircraft, rocket-powered interceptors, perhaps even atomic weapons. Could technological breakthroughs change the equation?" Takagi's response was bleak. Franklin's captured documents indicate the Americans are also developing advanced weapons, and they have far greater resources to devote to research. Every technological avenue we pursue, they pursue with 10 times the funding and 100 times the industrial capacity to produce results. We cannot out-innovate an enemy with such overwhelming resource advantages. The meeting dissolved without any decisions being made. What decisions could there be? The naval leadership couldn't simply surrender. The army still controlled government policy, and army leaders remained committed to fighting to the last. But privately, after examining Franklin, Japan's senior naval officers understood the war was lost. It had been lost not on the battlefield but in American shipyards, in the mathematics of industrial production that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. Captain Ome returned to Franklin one final time before the ship was partially dismantled for study of specific systems. He walked her silent corridors alone, trying to understand how his country had come to this point. Japan had started the war with the world's most powerful carrier force. They had struck devastating blows at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific. They had the best carrier pilots, the best carrier aircraft, years of combat experience. And yet, less than 3 years later, they faced defeat not because they'd been outfought, but because they'd been outproduced. He thought about the workers who had built Franklin in less than 2 years, thousands of American welders, riveters, electricians, and laborers, many of them women, many of them with minimal shipbuilding experience before the war. They had built this massive, sophisticated warship in the time it took Japan to build a single destroyer, and they'd done it 16 more times, with more ships under construction. It wasn't about Japanese workers being less skilled. It was about systems, about industrial organization, about resource availability. Standing on Franklin's silent flight deck, Ome could imagine it crowded with aircraft, with sailors, handling munitions and fuel, with the organized chaos of combat operations. This ship, built so quickly by a nation that had barely possessed a modern navy 2 generations ago, represented everything Japan lacked: resources, industrial capacity, technological infrastructure, and perhaps most importantly, a societal organization that could mobilize those resources with terrifying efficiency. The examination of Franklin revealed something more fundamental than tactical or technical details. It revealed that modern warfare had become industrialized to a degree that made traditional military virtues almost irrelevant. Courage, discipline, tactical skill, all still mattered, but they mattered less than factories, steel mills, oil refineries, and the ability to turn raw materials into weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. Japan had entered a modern industrial war with the mindset and resource base of a pre-industrial power. The result was foreordained. The irony wasn't lost on Japan's naval officers. They had studied American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, who emphasized that naval power rested on industrial capacity and merchant shipping. They had read about America's industrial might in World War I, when American factories had supplied the Allies and tipped the balance against Germany. They had known, intellectually, that America possessed vast industrial resources. But knowing and understanding are different things. Franklin forced understanding. In January 1945, Takagi wrote a personal letter to Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, the Navy minister, and one of the few senior leaders who had opposed going to war with America. "You were right," Takagi wrote simply. "Examining the American carrier has shown me that we were always going to lose this war, not because our sailors lacked courage or our tactics were flawed, but because the enemy possessed such overwhelming industrial superiority that defeat was inevitable from the first day. We should have listened to those who warned us. We should have understood that modern war is won in factories, not just on battlefields." Yonai's response, if any, is not recorded, but the sentiment echoed through Japan's naval command in those final months of the war. Officers who had believed in ultimate victory, who had dismissed warnings about American production capacity, now faced the reality embodied in Franklin's steel and machinery. The examination reports circulated among staff officers, each one reading them with growing despair. The war they were fighting couldn't be won. It had never been winnable. The mathematics had always been against them. The final disposition of Franklin remains somewhat unclear in historical records. Some accounts suggest she was partially broken up for scrap metal, desperately needed by Japanese industry. Others indicate she was used as a floating laboratory for studying American systems until destroyed in air raids on Kure Harbor in March 1945. What's certain is that her examination provided Japanese naval leadership with uncomfortable truths they could no longer ignore. By the time atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japan's surrender, the naval officers who had examined Franklin felt almost relieved. The war they'd known was unwinnable since December. 1944 would finally end. The terrible mathematics of industrial disparity would cease producing casualties. The carriers they couldn't build, the aircraft they couldn't manufacture, the pilots they couldn't train fast enough, all of it would become moot. Admiral Takagi survived the war and later wrote extensively about Japan's defeat. In his memoirs, he described examining Franklin as the moment he understood Japan had lost. "We thought the war was about tactics and courage," he wrote. "The Americans taught us it was about industrial capacity and systems. They built carriers like automobiles, operated them with standardized procedures, and replaced losses faster than we could inflict them. It wasn't even a fair fight. It was mathematics disguised as warfare." The lesson of Franklin echoed through post-war Japan. The nation that rebuilt from defeat did so by embracing the industrial efficiency they'd seen in American weapons. Japanese industry studied American production methods, adopted quality control systems, and emphasized efficiency over artisanal craftsmanship. The economic miracle of post-war Japan had roots in the harsh lessons learned examining American military equipment, understanding that modern competition, whether military or economic, demanded industrial efficiency at scale. For the officers who walked Franklin's corridors in November 1944, the experience was transformative and devastating. They had dedicated their lives to naval service, believing skill and spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Franklin proved them wrong with thousands of tons of evidence they couldn't dismiss. The ship they examined was just one of 17 identical vessels, with more coming. Japan could no more defeat that industrial tsunami than it could stop the tide with willpower. Standing on Kure's docks, watching Franklin's hulk, Captain Ome understood what many Japanese still didn't. The war was over. It had been over since American shipyards began cutting steel for Essex-class carriers. Everything since then, all the battles and casualties, all the desperate tactics and heroic sacrifices, had been fighting against mathematics. And mathematics, unlike human opponents, never tired, never surrendered, never even noticed the fight. It simply was, implacable and undeniable. The examination of one captured American carrier hadn't changed the war's outcome. That outcome had been determined by industrial capacity and resource availability long before, but it had changed the men who examined her, forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about modern warfare, about their nation's limitations, and about the hopelessness of their situation. They continued fighting because duty demanded it, but they did so knowing the end was inevitable, written in steel and rivets in shipyards they'd never seen, by workers they'd never face in battle, in quantities they couldn't match. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.